Hi, this is Harry Wagner from Harry Situations, and we're here with an exclusive new look at Ram's TRX truck. So TRX, T-Rex, they're calling this thing the Apex Predator, and they have their eyes set clearly on the Raptor. We're here at Wild West Motorsports Park outside of Reno, Nevada. Now, I have a history here. I've competitively rock crawled and super crawl at this site. I've raced in the Ultra4 Nationals at this site. And so I feel like I am well prepared to tell you how this truck works. I'm not going to talk to you about how many cup holders there are or how many USB outlets. We're looking specifically at the drivetrain, the suspension, the things that are similar to a Raptor and that set it apart. Right off the bat, you might notice this truck has Goodyear tires on it. I'll be honest with you, I prefer the BFG all-terrains. I haven't had good luck with the sidewalls and Goodyears, but this is a tire specifically designed for this truck. They're speed rated to 118 miles per hour. There was no other tire on the market that could fulfill that. So Ram worked with Goodyear to make tires specifically for this truck. They're also on an 18-inch rim, and what that does is allows a bigger brake. This has 15-inch front rotors and 14.3-inch rear rotors. They're huge. The braking power is great. And you need that when you have 702 horsepower under the hood. So this truck has a throaty exhaust note. It's not too obnoxious. I don't feel like it's something that would get old after a while. They've also tuned the exhaust so it doesn't drone in 7th and 8th gear when you're on the freeway. This does have an 8-speed automatic, which is great. Another thing you may notice, compared to a regular half-ton Ram, there's normally a dial here to shift. I've never cared for that. I feel like I'm going to turn up the volume and it's going to change the gears on me. This has a more traditional shifter, and in this space here you've got the mode selection for TRX, which you can choose between things like Sport, Baja, Rock, and you see this changes not only the shift points, but it allows you to use the paddle shifters, it changes the stability control, also the suspension settings and the steering input. So a really advanced system in this TRX. This truck, fully loaded, goes for about 90 grand. Even the base model TRX is about $70,000. That's about 20 grand more than a comparable Raptor. So we want to talk about what sort of features this has and if it's worth it for that price difference. So on the street, this truck will crush a Raptor. There's a lot of cars that are going to get embarrassed by this truck. It makes 702 horsepower from the Root style supercharged 6.2 liter Hemi engine that makes 11 PSI of boost and the 8-speed automatic. This truck runs 12s right out of the box in the quarter mile with 35-inch tall tires. It also has launch control, which is a feature that I thought was an interesting addition to this truck. Doesn't really fit the off-road theme. It also has backup assist to hook up a trailer. I thought that was curious. This isn't the truck I would get if I needed a tow, but it'll tow 8,000 pounds. It has greater payload capacity than a Raptor, even with coil rear suspension and links, as opposed to the leaf springs you find on a Raptor. So right out of the gate, there's a few advantages to the TRX on paper. We're about to take it out for a spin and see how it works in the real world. So we've got a 3.5 mile loop out here that they're going to take us on at Wild West Motorsports Park. Kind of typical Nevada terrain, the sort of thing if you were taking this, say, up to High Rock Canyon or down 395 and into like the Bristlecone Pines, the sort of terrain you would encounter. Should give us a good opportunity to really test the suspension. This truck has heads-up display. There's a lot of bells and whistles on here, which I think add to the purchase price. So we're testing this truck and putting it through its paces. Really rocky here. I wouldn't want to spin the tires. That's a good way to kill one. It also makes this sort of chop. Of course, they want us to test the truck, so these guys are carrying more speed than I am through here. The transfer case in this is really interesting. It's from Borg Warner, so it's full-time four-wheel drive. You can lock it in high or lock it in low. This truck also has the optional Eaton electric locker in the rear Dana 60 axle, and that you're able to lock at any speed. So some other vehicles on the market, you can only use the lockers in low range. That's not the case here. We should talk more about the rear axle. It's a 6-lug, full-floating Dana 60, which is the first of its kind from the factory. And being a full-floating design means that the axle shaft just has to turn. There's actually a hub out at the end like you would have on the front of a vehicle, and the hub carries the weight, but the axle shaft just has to transfer power. They're pretty common in 3/4 and 1-ton trucks, but you don't really see that in a 1/2-ton truck until now. The bad side of a full floating rear axle is they're heavy. So this axle weighs over 150 pounds more than the typical rear end you would find under a 1/2-ton Ram. I mean, it's a lot stronger, but that's also unsprung weight, which the suspension has to control over this rough terrain. Everything's really a trade-off. This is a vehicle that makes 700 horsepower, and you have to beef up all the components as a result. So Ram's got some folks out here helping them that I just happen to be friends with. Josh Hall, who mentioned that this course is typical of Northern Nevada. You've got a lot of silt, but it's got square edge rocks hiding within it. And then Alex Baker, Jimmy Jack, Jake Yeoman, all local Reno guys that have a lot of experience off-road that Ram's brought out here to help the journalists. Yeah, that guy got going and then realized he can't see anything. It feels really stable and planted. The body is 8 inches wider than a typical Ram. The track width is 6 inches wider. And what that does is, with the same frame width, you get longer A-arms. So longer A-arms provide geometry where longer A-arms allow for geometry where you can get more suspension travel through the same arc. So this truck has 13 inches of front wheel travel and 14 inches of rear wheel travel, which are pretty comparable to a Raptor. A lot of the other dimensions are similar to a Raptor as well: breakover, approach and departure angles. One key difference is this truck weighs 1,500 pounds more than a Ford Raptor. Part of that's due to the aluminum construction in the Ford, part of it's due to other features like only having a V6 and somewhat smaller components because it has less horsepower. And all that weight you have to control off-road, so it's not always a good thing. The rear shock mounts on these trucks hang down pretty low, not that unlike the new Wrangler. And the reason being is they're trying to keep that under the bed of the truck. So you're trying to package a longer shock for more suspension travel, but still keep the bed intact. The only real option is to go lower, but ground clearance suffers as a result. So now we've shifted in a 4-low. We're going up this steep, loose hill, and this has select speed mode. And how this works is basically similar to some other off-road systems, off-road cruise control that you see in Toyotas, Jeeps, Land Rover products. And basically I can select whatever speed I want to go at. It'll show me right on the dash here, and can just adjust it with the paddle shifters, and my feet aren't even on the pedals. The shocks on this truck are one of the most interesting aspects. So a traditional shock has a piston that oil flows through, and that piston has steel shims above and below it to control the compression and the rebound. The shims deflect and let oil pass. Those shocks are velocity sensitive, so the faster the shock shaft moves, the more oil flows around it. You also have bypass shocks, which are position sensitive. So something like a Ford Raptor, you're going to have a softer setup where you're normally riding on the road, and then it's able to stiffen the suspension. For instance, if you're jumping or in rugged terrain, you don't just blow through the travel to the bump stops. It actually stiffens up depending on the position. These shocks are unique. These are Bilstein Blackhawk E2 dampers, and they're electronically controlled. So a lot more high tech than a traditional bypass shock. What they do is actually have inputs from a variety of sensors, from steering wheel angle to where the suspension is cycling, and it can adjust in 20 milliseconds to control the rebound and the compression damping on the fly. So really a more active suspension where something like a bypass shock is passive. One of the unique features this vehicle has that the Ram engineers were explaining to me is that there are sensors that detect where the suspension is within the travel. So when this vehicle leaves the ground, they actually firm up the dampers so you don't bottom out when you land, and the clutch releases in the transfer case so you don't scatter it either. They also limit the throttle input, so the tires aren't turning at 100 miles an hour when you're doing 70 miles an hour and you land. This reduces shock loads in the drivetrain and is super advanced. No other vehicle on the market does this. The front axle and front suspension on this truck shares some parts with the normal Ram. It still has the aluminum center section and an open front differential, so they're giving up some ground there to Ford that uses a torsion limited slip in the Raptor. I'm also a little concerned about power with an aluminum front diff. I'd prefer to see a cast iron diff in this, but we'll see if it proves to be an issue or not. I've had issues in the past with trucks with aluminum front diffs. When the traction control tries to apply one brake, it flexes the housing and has caused them to crack. The control arms on this, in addition to being 3 inches wider per side than a normal Ram, are also forged, making them considerably stronger. Now the half shafts in a normal Ram truck use a flanged outer with a CV axle that floats in the diff to allow the suspension to cycle. This has more travel than a normal Ram, so what they did was they actually have flanged axles on each end at the diff and the wheel, and the axle shaft plunges in between. The axle shafts on this truck are huge. I don't think you're ever going to have an issue breaking those. A few components from Ram's heavy-duty trucks found their way into the TRX. Those include flanged drive lines instead of a normal U-bolt strap, and also they're using bushings out of the 3/4 ton truck rear control arms on this truck. It's a larger bushing, it's going to offer more suspension articulation and deflection, but also wear better and last longer than a half-ton model. Many people might think that this is Ram's first entry into the desert racing market, but they actually have a long history, dating back to the 70s when Rod Hall campaigned a Ram truck, and they even made a special edition of his truck that bring a lot of money these days. Walker Evans also raced a Ram, and he dusted off his truck a few years ago and brought it to the Nora Mexican 1000 and won overall. More recently, Kent Croker made the Ram Runner of the previous generation half-ton Ram. Now that wasn't something that was offered from the factory, it was offered through Mopar, and you could add long travel suspension to your half-ton Ram, fiberglass fenders and things like that. But it didn't have nearly the fit and finish of this TRX, not to mention the horsepower. There's different modes here in the TRX. If we put this into sport mode and then we go to race options, we can activate launch control. So what that does is you can use this at the track, on the street. We're in the dirt now. You hit the brake. Now we're gonna hit the gas. Let off the brake. It goes from 4 cylinders to 8 and moves like a rocket. It definitely pushes you back in the seat. I love how this tranny shifts. It's got a really flat torque curve and a wide power band and 8 speeds, so there's never like, the power never falls off. It's just linear all the way across. It's with the all-wheel drive. It's really controlled. This thing doesn't get squirrely at all. It just goes in a straight line and shoots like a rocket ship. We were doing 70 miles an hour before I let off and we ran out of space. I really like the soft touch tailgate on this truck. It's a nice feature. The tie down rails are great. One option I would not get is the spare tire. It really doesn't allow you to use your truck as a truck. The good news is you can fit a 35-inch spare tire underneath the truck in the factory position. I would just go that route and forego the spare in the bed personally. Now the hood scoop on this truck is completely functional, and the grille they have actually opened up in the letters to allow more air into this engine. Another thing they've done is they actually have dual air filters. So the ducting on this, it actually, the filtration is great, 40% better than anything else on the market. And another thing Ram's done, throwing down the gauntlet on the Raptor. So this engine architecture is found in the Hellcat and the Trackhawk Grand Cherokee. But one thing they did specifically for this truck, knowing it was going to be used off-road, is they ducted the air in through the hood, and they used dual air intake elements in order to filter out any dust or silt you might encounter. So we ran some hot laps out here at Wild West Motorsports Park in the Ram TRX, and I have to say I was really impressed. We were going off tabletops at 60 miles an hour. The truck is completely capable and really stable. So there's none of the hopping that you'll get if you don't have enough rebound. The shocks work really well. The truck just plants to the ground. We went over whoops, we went off of jumps, toss it into corners. It's totally tractable and works really well. I was super impressed. It's a great time to be a truck owner. The Raptor and the TRX are both wonderful trucks. Whether the TRX is worth 20 grand more or not is really up to you and your intended use. But if you ever want to hit the drag strip or you spend more time on the pavement, this is the easy choice. I'd like to thank Ram for letting us come out here today and test drive this truck and put it through its paces. These will be available starting in December of 2020 at your local Ram dealership, so put in your order now.